Alex Chisnall, welcome to the podcast. How are you?
I'm pretty good. Yeah, pleasure to be here. So thank you for inviting me, Alan.
No, the pleasure's mine. I am really looking forward to this because as a seasoned podcaster yourself and a far more experienced and successful podcaster, I'm hoping to learn a lot about the sort of the mysteries of podcasting and brand building in general. But we're going to come to that. Before we do, let's go back and, if you don't mind, just share your kind of entrepreneurial journey, because I know you didn't necessarily start off as a business owner, as an entrepreneur. So how did you get started?
Yeah, so you're right. I literally went straight from uni into BBC Radio, which a lot of people in podcasting now have come from that direction. And via a circuitous route involving working for Richard Branson at Virgin Atlantic. The opportunity came up in the last financial crisis, 2008, 2009, to take voluntary redundancy. And I'd spent my last couple of years at Virgin not massively enjoying it, in that I wasn't going out seeing the sights, I wasn't going out and partying, which was a big part of working for Virgin Atlantic, but I was staying in my room and just researching different business ideas. And I'd always said that I wanted to leave Virgin before I was 40, and I was 39 at the time then, and so my wife works for Virgin as well as a beauty therapist in upper class, so they figured out they could still run an airline, they could still cut costs and could still fly an airplane without needing to give people massages and manicures, so they got rid of all 300 beauty therapists, and wow. They kept making a better offer for those more senior staff, those on a higher payroll like myself at the time. I'd gone as far as I could go at Atlantic. And the more the offers kept stacking up, the more I just thought, you know what? I think now's the time to go. There'd be a bit of symmetry if I went at the same time as my wife. She was pregnant with our second child. And I didn't like going away so much. We used to do a long trip that was like 9 days away, going via Hong Kong and Sydney. So the offer came in, a year's salary, and 2 years of free flights. You could basically fly anywhere in the world if you paid the £100 tax. So I was like, do you know what? This is probably about as good as it's going to get. So I had that kind of
sounds good
safety net, to do that. So I left. I retrained at the time as a personal trainer because I had an interest. I used to spend my summers when at university in Bath. I used to go over to America and coach sports, and I was really into my health and fitness. And what I used to really enjoy at Virgin was actually mentoring staff and helping them get their promotions and set them on their career path. So I kind of put the two together, and ultimately I came across. I was introduced to a book called Rich Dad Poor Dad, which many people listening probably would have come across, Robert Kiyosaki, and that kind of changed the way that I looked at life. And at the time, as a personal trainer, I was just I guess I just bought myself a job. Basically, it didn't really feel like a business. You were working 120 hours a week for less money, yet you thought, hooray, I'm my own boss. This is brilliant.
Yeah, I'm free. Yeah.
Free,
classic entrepreneur. Yeah.
That was it. And then
with the worst boss in the world, yourself.
Yes, that's a great point. Literally the worst boss in the world, who constantly beat me and everything. Yeah. So I then came across an organization called MPE, who are now a client of my podcast agency, funnily enough. And they introduced me to different systems and processes and how you could free yourself from this, hamster in the wheel, and actually take that step back and employ other people, put the right systems and processes in place. So I specialized in sports injuries, and I ended up opening 4 sports injury clinics. We'd have mobile personal training, we'd have a boot camp, all that kind of stuff. So that was essentially my first foray into being a business owner, into being an entrepreneur, and ultimately, like many people's first businesses, that ultimately ended up in failure when I tried to be overly ambitious and tried to run before I could walk, basically.
Wow, that's really interesting. So a number of things there, which I think we should sort of unpack a bit more. But I'm always very interested in that initial transition, because you go, and I know you said you've gone as far as you can at Virgin, but you also mentioned you've got the sort of backdrop of your wife, and then she's leaving at the same time, as you said, and you've got a kid coming, along the way. So you move from what was a relatively, I guess, stable financial circumstances to one with, I know you had a sort of a financial cushion, but there was far less stability in terms of going forward. I mean, going back to those days and remembering the kind of the whole thought process you went through, can you just sort of go through that dynamic about what, you're entering to a really kind of risky period of time in terms of, creating financial security for your family? What sort of prompted, tell us more about making that leap.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think because I'd waited and waited till the best offer came along, like the final offer for voluntary. My wife had already started. She'd left it worked out. We were talking about it the other day, actually. It actually worked out. She'd left maybe 9 months before me then, so she'd already set up a business as a beauty therapist. So she was doing really well at it. So she had, money coming in, and it's funny. You do things at the time, and you probably don't think them out as well, because at the time, and I only know this in hindsight, obviously, at the time you think, wow, a year's salary sounds amazing. That's going to last forever. We'll really eke that out, and a year's salary doesn't last a year. It kind of burned through that in probably, I don't know, 6, 7, 8, maybe 9 months. And the first idea that I had. It's interesting talking to you about this, actually, because it brings up some memories that I'd forgotten about. But at the time, again, one of the reasons I left was because my cousin's husband had said that he was going to back the idea that we had, which is like a lot of people, when you've got small children, you come up with ideas based around the circumstances you're in. And the first idea we had was around a children's play area. But it was, we'd literally been all over the country researching these different ones, and he'd basically, he's a hedge fund manager, and he said he was going to back us. And when it came to it, he didn't. He wanted to take far more control of that business than I wanted, really. You want to leave because you want to be your own boss, and all of a sudden it's, no, this is the plan. We're going to open this one, then we're going to open another 50, and it was like, hang on a minute, this wasn't remotely my vision. So all of a sudden, that financial security in inverted commas, because it was like, okay, here he is putting hundreds of thousands of pounds into the business, and you've got a guaranteed salary, and you've got a runway. All of a sudden, that was gone, and that's when I had to kind of think on my feet and go, okay, I'd actually started training as a personal trainer. Let's finish that course. There's an obvious route there to start earning money. But no, you're right. Looking back at it, it's pretty sketchy, really, when it comes to that security element, because that got whipped away pretty quickly, and that kind of false sense of security of a year's salary started coming up in the rearview mirror very quickly as well. Child number 2 came very quickly as well, but I did manage to get on my feet pretty quickly. Like the first sports injury clinic we opened happened to be in the second busiest leisure centre in the UK, which I didn't know at the time. So we did very well from that, and I was then able to, like I say, look at growing and scaling that business. It just, in hindsight, I try to do too much too quickly.
Yeah, I just find it really interesting. And I know from other conversations I've had, and I know people who listen to this podcast, there's quite a few who are in that situation that you've gone through and I've gone through in a job that they don't really love, but the leap into saying, it sounds easy, doesn't it? Start your own business, and if you don't like it, you can be your own boss. You can create the business in exactly the way you want. But it's a leap into the unknown, as you just described, and the financial circumstances. If you've got to put mouths to feed and food on the table and all that sort of that stuff. And maybe I was just reflecting, and we'll speak more about your podcast, but that's the title of the name of the podcast. Screw it, just do it. Because I guess at some point, I know it's a quote from Richard Branson or his book, But at some point, you just got to take that leap, and it is into the unknown, and you've got to sort of be adaptable, be able to pivot. And as you've done, it's really interesting. You went into one thing and then it didn't quite work out. So quite quickly, you've had to do something else. Tell me about, did you, and at your time at Virgin, did you spend much time around Sir Richard Branson?
Yeah, it's interesting. At the time, and you kind of reflect back and you think, crikey, there I was, I started Virgin when I was like 24, I think. And you think, crikey, he must have been early 40s. Yeah, he owned Virgin Records, which at the time, had like the Rolling Stones, Culture Club, these huge bands. Yeah. And he owned an airline. And you kind of think back and you're like, wow, he's really pretty young at the time. And you kind of reflect back and you thought, I actually wished I'd asked him some half decent questions. But of course, at the time, here you are with your boss. And I have got some vivid memories, being in LA, round the pool, at the hotel bar with the baby, white grand piano. And there he is going out for dinner with Mr. Hilton. And I don't know his name, but whoever owned Hilton Hotels. And the second man on the moon, Buzz Aldrin. And I just thought, that's going to be a really interesting dinner, isn't it? And he was just like, I've put my card behind the bar. We'd all been having drinks with him beforehand, put his card behind the bar and he's like, carry on drinking. And you kind of think back and I wish I'd actually asked him some interesting questions. But of course, at the time you're young and someone's offering you to buy free drinks and it's the boss, you're just going to take it, And look, I was like it was amazing to be with Virgin at that time. But over the years, to answer your question, you saw less and less of him. And I've got memories of being in room parties with him. I've got memories of being in South Africa for the launch of Virgin Cola. Again, not one of his successful businesses, but that was because the big boys, Coca-Cola and Pepsi, if you read his books, ensured that basically the supermarkets wouldn't stock his products, and they squeezed him out. Very similar to, I guess, to BA's tactics of stealing their passengers at the time, But we used to see a lot of him then, and then you'd see less and less of him. He'd still host us every year, which was amazing actually, at his house in Kidlington near Oxford, and you'd basically just bring your tent, camp in the grounds, and there would be bands, entertainment. His house was open. I always remember my brother going in there and making himself switching the TV on and watching the Lennox Lewis Frank Bruno fight, and Richard's wife making my brother a sandwich while I was watching it, and Richard telling him to turn the lights off before he went to bed, which I thought was hilarious. And then you'd see less and less of him. You hear he'd then he had the house at Holland Park in London, he had the house in Oxfordshire, but then he bought Necker Island and he moved himself out there. And then, through another iteration, I got reeled back into the Virgin Group and started working for Virgin Startup, his not-for-profit, helping entrepreneurs with funding and mentoring. And he would literally come over, but he would come over and he would literally have every 15 minutes of his day scoped out with meetings of all these 200 odd different Virgin businesses. So he would touch base with the CEO and the MD of Virgin Startup, and that was kind of it. You'd see him come into the offices in Battleship Building in Paddington, and that was kind of it, really. I've got other friends, who've been out to Necker Island because, again, people might not know this, but he was always very generous. Whenever he was flying out to the Caribbean, he would invite crew who were on that trip to go and stay over in Necker Island. So he'd always go put everyone's name into a hat. I'm going to pull out 3 names, and those people will get to spend 2 nights on Necker instead of the 2 nights in Antigua or Barbados or St. Lucia where we were. And they always ended up being blonde and female. It was never me, but I've got friends who've been there multiple times, but I never ended up there once, Alan. But there you go.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, I mean, I see him as an incredibly inspiring entrepreneur, and he's in his 70s now, and he's still no doubt sort of carrying on, building businesses, growing companies, and all that. So it's great, I think, just to be around that. And I presume that the kind of working in Virgin at that time was quite an entrepreneurial, dynamic environment. It would be often businesses are in the in the mold of the founder and the chairman or CEO or whatever. So I'd imagine that was a pretty good time for you, and interesting. The time you were learning a lot.
Yeah, definitely, and it was definitely 100% that attitude prevailed. It felt like a startup, and at the time, you didn't realize you still saw the public perception, and it looked like really big airline on getting lots of press coverage. He was always one for the PR stunts. Every time you'd fly to a new destination, he'd always be dressing up as a cowboy if it was flying to Texas or whatever. But at the time, it had that kind of energy of a startup, and that your voice was heard, and you could make suggestions, and you had to think on your feet, and not everything was as smooth as you probably thought it would be. Like, I remember flying to Cuba for the first time, and it was Puerto Rico actually, and all the usual stuff that was done for you, like there'll be a taxi, a bus waiting here, and they'll take the crew here. None of that was there. It was complete disorganized chaos, and I'm literally using my own phone to phone back to London to then liaise with the authorities there, and then they're trying to reimburse me for using my phone it was definitely that feel that they were working things out as they went along. But it was a great energy at the time, and having those summer parties at his house, being invited like to the roof gardens in Kensington in London for parties and stuff. It was a great time, and obviously as you think back and you think, wow, he was in his early to mid 40s. His kids were still young at the time, I think. So he was enjoying himself, and he was on a roll at the time, and kudos to him for sure.
Absolutely. And again, that's it. Interesting as well. On one hand, you said often we can look, those of us who are running businesses, we know the business from the inside, and it's kind of there's often a lot of chaos and things not working out. And you look at some of these bigger organizations, you think, God, I wish we could be like them. They look really amazing and smooth and everything else. But probably I think every business behind the scenes is slightly chaotic a bit, as it's and particularly the other thing there that I think about as businesses sort of grow and get more mature and hire more staff, it can get a bit sort of corporate, like, and it gets the original business, the sort of the excitement of the sort of startup. I know that reading about like Jeff Bezos and Amazon have got this concept of like every day is day one. Just even though they're huge, multi-billion, trillion business, but the idea of continuing to act in many ways and having the spirit of a startup, of a really entrepreneurial, dynamic business, I think that's quite important to do. So obviously you enjoyed your time there, but as you say, then you went on and started this business, but it didn't succeed, your first business.
No, it didn't. And I think, I know, looking back now, I know the mistake I made there. I literally, discovered this organization, read this book, and all of a sudden it was like the curtains parted and I could see, the light at the end of the tunnel. But I made the mistake of, I think, taking it too literally, in that I went from, having all these clients that I was personally working with, hands-on, one-on-one, to then going literally, and I'm sure it was in the space of a month, I literally went completely hands-off and went, here are your new trainers and therapists to look after you. I'm now looking after the business. And of course, you learn as you get older, or you hope that you learn. You form a relationship with people, and people buy from people, so they want to see you. And I definitely jumped back from the day-to-day running far too quickly. I should have eased myself out of it. I should have maybe kept a core of clients who'd been with me from right at the beginning, and kind of eased myself, and then introduced them with sessions with other trainers and therapists. But I didn't. I got all excited. I leapt out, and things took a hit. I got sold this dream of opening another site in an area called Sandbanks, which many people may have heard of. It's one of the 10th most expensive areas per square foot for property in the world, I believe. But I got sold this dream, brand new yacht club, restaurant, cafe, therapists to cover every type of ailment you'd have. And they're like, come in here. And it sounded great. But what you soon realize, again, and a mistake I made was not doing enough research, I think, at the time, was that the people who lived there, it's a very small area, for one. If you look at it on Google Maps, you'll see it's just this little spit of land, a sandbank that sticks out into the sea. And these people, yes, the majority of them are very wealthy, but by the nature of having that kind of wealth, Alan, they have a second home in the home counties, another home in Mallorca, another home in the Caribbean, and they're not there 12 months of the year. And
Right.
I couldn't run that kind of business without regular clients. And
Right.
the overheads were twice they were. It was harder to recruit staff for that area because it was harder to get to in the summer. It's a nightmare to get into that area. Massive traffic jams and stuff. So hadn't done my research on that really. And people looked at it like from the surrounding areas more of a treat to come, more as a one-off birthday anniversary treat than, no, it's a sports injury clinic. We need to see you more than once. This is the program we're putting together for you. You've consistently re-injuring yourself training for this marathon or triathlon. This is the program that you need to do, and we'll work together with the gym that's here and the chiropractor. But didn't work out, and it ended up very expensive lesson of basically robbing Peter to pay Paul and taking the money from the well-performing site to the less performing sites. We'd opened 2 kind of satellite sites in different leisure centres as well, but just didn't have the footfall and the traffic to make it work as well. And we ended up going down that route of trying to bring people in through that kind of, it wasn't Groupon, but it was that kind of model, bringing people in at a discount and hoping to then upsell them.
Sure.
And yes, there's, percentage that will sign up, but it was just a tough sell in that kind of an area, to be honest with you. So huge learnings, all around, doing your research, treating staff as you'd like to be treated yourself, and maybe giving them more of a heads up as to what was actually happening in the business, and who you recruited and why you recruited them. So lots of learnings.
I'm sure. And it must have been a stressful time. You're spending a lot of money. Your overheads, the money's not coming in, and you can running your own business there. You begin to look at your sort of future trajectory if you carry on like this. How did you feel about that? And you got what, 1 or 2 young children at the time. Was it just? It was a very stressful period, and so how did you deal with that?
It was not very well. I don't think. Without a doubt, Alan, it was the most stressful period of my life. And it ended up, I was just speaking on the Secret Leaders podcast actually, as well. And we mentioned, they all talk, and their podcast is all around failure. And for me, it was incredibly stressful, so much so that, and I should have clocked this again, the people that you do business with and the relationships you make. And I remember the first day that I actually met the guy who owned the entire site. I got introduced to him. He was on the other side of the gym, looking at different bits and pieces before it was open, and he kind of looked over at me, and I went towards him to shake my hand. I went, "Hi, I'm Alex." He just looked at me, turned around, carried on doing what he was doing, and I kind of thought, okay, that's an interesting way to deal with your new tenants who are paying you every month.
Yep.
And he just didn't have very good social skills, and I should have clocked that from the off, I really should have, and ended up, with a tsunami of problems on my shoulders, so much so that he ended up, locking my staff out of the treatment rooms, me, unable then, and I'm, happy talking about this now because I'm glad this happened to me, because if it hadn't happened to me, I wouldn't be what I'm doing now and who I am. I'd be a completely different person, I'm sure. But literally ended up, not being able to pay the business bills, not being able to pay the personal bills, debt collectors at the door. Horrendous, worst experience of my life. Nothing. I wouldn't have even wished it on him, who became, like the enemy in not just my eyes, but pretty much everybody who worked there just hated working in that kind of environment. The black cloud coming into the building, with the thunder and lightning. But it's great lessons. And I know everybody, listening, if it helps somebody listening who's in a situation as a startup or an entrepreneur and it's not necessarily going according to plan, there's always someone who's in a worse situation than you, and it's that phrase, isn't it? I don't know if it's Winston Churchill. Just keep going. When the going gets tough, never give up, keep going. And yeah, it was incredibly stressful, and like you say, having young kids, a wife who's self-employed as well. It was definitely not the route that I wanted to go down. Was not part of the business plan.
Yeah, definitely not. And I mean, it's interesting. In all the conversations I've had since the start of this podcast, no business owner, no one said, he started a business, everything ran smoothly and it was wonderful. We sold out for millions. It was great. Every single person had challenges of, I guess it's all relative depending on the circumstances, but some were just horrendous, really, really bad, and mental health becomes an issue. And so, but I think that's the point. This resilience is so important. If you can't face this sort of challenge, don't ever try to start a business, because I'm guaranteeing you that something's going to happen that you're not going to enjoy it. And so you've got to sort of, I guess that, as you say, you didn't want this to happen. You didn't enjoy the process, but it helps build the resilience, doesn't it?
It does, and you definitely develop that thick skin. And I think building resilience is important. I mean, look, we could all stay in bed, couldn't we? We could all sit on the sofa and watch daytime TV. But if you want to improve as a person, if you want to if you have aims for a better life, and a better life can obviously mean many things to many different people. But if you want to push yourself and find out what you're really capable of, then definitely starting a business is something that's going to do that. I'm a great believer in setting yourself goals, both personally, business wise, but also physically as well as mentally. So for me, it brings it home. Literally 2 days ago, this time last year, I ran the New York Marathon. And again, training for something like that and doing something like that, again, really builds resilience and finds out what you're capable of, because all different parts of your body are screaming out in pain and telling you to stop, and that voice in your head's telling you to stop. And it's the same with running a business. The sensible voice in your head is telling you, go back to the comfortable job, go back and take the salary, take the stress out of the equation. But you're striving for something. You're striving for something to improve yourself, to give yourself, your family, a better lifestyle, to give them other opportunities, and to see how far you can go, really. I think to push yourself mentally and physically, and see what you're truly capable of. And resilience is key to that. Yeah,
absolutely. And you've just reminded me of something. I saw, Gerald Ratner of Ratner's, and I saw him speak just last week. Really, really interesting character, and it's just reflecting on what you've just been saying. After all the kind of the infamous speech he gave, and effectively lost an entire, very significant, multi-billion-pound business. And he said in this talk, I went to bed for 7 years. He stayed in bed for 7 years, couldn't do anything, couldn't get out of bed.
Seriously?
And he said that. And he said, and you know what really eventually he said, my wife is great. And eventually she said, just, if you don't get out of bed, I'm eventually, you've got to start doing something. And he took up cycling, and he said, and to this day, at 74 years old, he said, I cycle 24 miles every single day. And he said, that's the single biggest thing that really got me going. Because, and again, interested in your take on that, because obviously you've got a background, currently sort of physical health, but this is this crossover between physical health and mental health, business challenges, entrepreneurship, business failures, and the role that exercise plays. He just said that, whatever the dopamine, the chemicals that you get from pretty tough exercise, he said, it saved me. He said, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a great segue, Alan. I really like that. I didn't know he was 74 now as well. And I do remember that infamous speech, and I didn't realize business was that big either at the time. 24 miles a day, that's going some, isn't it? That's pretty good. But yeah, I'm the same. And I've definitely, I feel I know that, again, when I get stressed through business, that's the thing. And you try and work, or I do at least, try and work harder for longer, but not necessarily smarter. And the thing you should do, and again, Dan Murray Serta, I recently had on my podcast, founder of Heights and Secret Leaders podcast. He's like, just go for a walk. Just take yourself and go for a walk. And I think for me, it's the physical exercise, but it's also being outside, being in nature. And I combine those two. So my favorite thing that I do, like on a Saturday, I take my youngest daughter to Pony Club, which she has for like 2 hours. And while she's there, it's in the New Forest, which is a beautiful part of the world. And I just go on a trail run. And I've only discovered trail running in the last couple of years. It was like when I did my first marathon, I was just pounding the streets. And I've learned that actually that doesn't light me up at all, really. It's quite brutal and repetitive. Whereas being out, when I go, I will literally just see ponies. When I went on my last run last Saturday, there was a stag who was literally watching me from the forest that I just clocked with massive horns, just looking right at me.
Fabulous, yeah.
And it was amazing. And I think it plays a huge role. And you just got to find what works for you. And it could be just going for a walk every day, like Dan says. It could be like Gerald says, cycling. Yeah. For me, running, I love walking as well. I love going for like hikes, if they involve a country pub, fantastic as well at the weekend, trying to get the kids out and the family. But yeah, for me, it's like I've found when life works, it's when I have, and that's like the business is working well, personal life is going well. It's the fact that I've set myself business challenges, but I've also set myself personal challenges. So I'll have like a half marathon or a marathon to aim for. So I'm focused, I'm training for something, and I don't have that at the moment. And I find myself slipping into those bad habits again of like craving sugar, having a drink, not going out for a run. So for me, it's huge. And I always remember, David Goggins, I remembered this when I was doing the marathon, and him saying, going back to your point around resilience, he was like, if you do enough of these things enough times, he makes this analogy of, you're eating cookies, you're putting them back in the cookie jar. And he goes, so that when you actually come through that point in your life where you're facing some real hardship, he goes, you can pull that cookie out of the jar, you can pull that memory, and you know what it feels like, and you know that you've been through it, and you know that you can get through it again. But if, as we said, you've lived that life where you've never taken a risk, you've never taken on a challenge, you've literally stayed in bed, or you've sat on the sofa and watched TV every night, then you haven't built that resilience. You don't know what it's like to get through that. So you give up. Yeah. You give up.
Yeah. Really, really interesting. So you have this business, and did you have to close the business down then, or what was it? They just sort of terminated? And
I actually ended up selling it to a local physiotherapist, and interestingly enough, he had multiple sites, had been doing it far longer than I had relationships with like GPs, NHS, had a really, what looked like from the outside again, a really sound business. He wasn't able to make that work at that site either. He wasn't able to make it work in Sandbanks, even though, he had another site in the next area to that. So, I managed to get rid of it. At the time, I'd started working with Virgin Startup. So subconsciously, I had something lined up that I was able to go into. And I'd been working for them as a mentor. They then had asked me to work as a business advisor, which I'd started doing part-time. And then that ultimately morphed into me being asked to do that full-time, and then being asked to go, you're our most successful business advisor, and we'd like you to actually become a delivery partner for us and take on, I think it was about 9 counties in the UK for them, which is what I did. So you kind of look back in, that Steve Jobs quote about being able to join the dots. It's only when you look back, you can do that. And I can kind of do that now and go, actually, serendipitously, I had that I'd already started, and I'd really enjoyed helping other entrepreneurs at the very early stages of their business. So I managed to segue into that, and I managed to earn more money actually doing that and having a better life doing that until that ultimately changed as well. But for a period, and that was out of my control. That was the government and their red tape for that scheme, cutting the payments that delivery partners and business advisors were getting, etc. And it became, to one of your first points, actually, Alan, of working for an organization that all of a sudden went from being very entrepreneurial to being very blue chip and layers and layers and layers and layers and layers of red tape.
And that was not for you after that. And what was Virgin Startup? And was it a fund itself? Is this an organization that was investing in startup companies?
No, so they were a delivery partner for the startup loan scheme. So you would have like the Prince of Wales Trust was like the biggest partner within that scheme, but there was partners for every county in the UK, and obviously the Virgin name being kind of synonymous with Richard and entrepreneurship and business was a kind of natural partner for that scheme. But they were getting funding from the government and providing startup loans, and then providing mentoring for everybody that took our startup loan as well. So it was a government-backed scheme, and thereby there came the extra red tape, and it was fun. It was again a real fantastic buzz, because the way that I learned that Richard actually starts these companies was when I was there. He also started a number of other businesses. One of them was Virgin Sport, and I always remember, interesting seeing how he'd start a business, and he would literally go, I don't have the skill set to do this, but I've got the connections to be able to get someone who's better qualified than me to start this business. So Virgin Sport, how do you start a business like Virgin Sport? Okay, I know. Let's get the CEO of the biggest sports organization in the entire world, which I didn't know was the New York Marathon, funnily enough. So he got the CEO of the New York Marathon, put her behind a desk, gave her something like 3 support staff, which again is really interesting, because you think, if you think of Richard Branson, or I did at least, you think of Richard Branson starting a new company, you think of like hundreds of staff. But no, he's like, let's see if this is actually going to work. Let's give her 3 support staff to start things off. Let's incentivize her by giving her shares in that business as well. And let's see if we make it a go. And it was, very much the same at Virgin Startup. He made it. It was his not-for-profit, and it was very much, similar theory in that, it was a startup environment. It was only, I think at the time, 12, 15 maybe staff, because it had been going for a couple of years when I joined. So really interesting way to start a business, to be honest with you.
Yeah, it is. I'm just reflecting on that as well. Obviously, Richard Branson having these, I guess by then he's got almost like a template. This is how to do a startup. And even then they won't work. But there was specifically, clearly keep the costs really low, keep the costs down, have only a couple of staff. It's all just as a test case to see if this works. And another thing that's interesting is the incentivization. Give equity. All of a sudden, that incentives just drive behavior. That's the bottom line, isn't it? So he's obviously worked that out as a model. And even then, often these businesses, even ones backed by Richard Branson, haven't worked out, as you say, for various reasons. Not everything's been successful.
No.
So that's interesting. Talk to me a little bit about mentorship then. Obviously, you were a mentor. That's a kind of, it's a broad-based word. What does that mean? What does it look like? And what's the benefits of mentoring?
Yeah, and it's interesting actually. How I got into that was some friends had taken a scheme run by the YMCA that apparently was being piloted in the Far East, I think Singapore, somewhere like that, and they brought it to Bournemouth, where I'm based, and it was basically going into a bit like Dragon's Den, except it was called the Lion's Den, and you'd have these mentors, and they asked me to get involved, and I absolutely loved it, and it kind of reminded me of being back at summer camp in America, working with kids, and basically involved me going into local schools, kids pitching their business ideas, us taking the best ones, YMCA giving them some money, and the aim was to turn that business idea into a money-making venture that they made enough money to pay that money back to YMCA and make a profit and give that to charity. And interestingly enough, that got me into mentoring. And for me, it's somebody, it's a sounding board, it's support, it's somebody to bounce ideas off. And I think it's very different to a coach who's more hands-on and maybe has a framework of working with you. And it was very serendipitous as to how I got to work with Virgin Startup, because I'd worked with a YMCA scheme. I loved it, and I just thought, how can I do more of this? And I literally saw an ad on Facebook for Virgin Startup asking for mentors, and clicked on it, applied, went for the interview, got offered it. And even though I thought, this isn't helping kids, but let's see where it leads. And I thought, I don't know how, when, where, or why, but at some point in my life, and it hasn't happened yet, but it will come full circle, and I will end up helping kids who are the people I really want to help.
Sure.
But yeah, for me, I think it was being that sounding board. It was being that person who could offer advice, who had some war wounds. Not somebody who was one of these business advisors who never started a business. I think that's the worst kind of business advisor.
Absolutely,
you've got to have the war wounds, haven't you, Alan? The scars.
You absolutely do. You absolutely do. Because you're not going to forget those, and they are invaluable to share. You're trying then to help the person that you're mentoring to avoid those and minimize them, or at least support them through if they're going through those things. And I think also the entrepreneurship journey can be quite lonely. And even if you've got business partners, I think you're too wrapped up and it's sort of emotionally engaged with it to get rational sort of conversations with even friends, family. But to have a third party sort of independent person that is, as you say, has got the war wounds and got the experience and can be perhaps a bit more objective. And also, and I would certainly encourage anyone to sort of look into that, seek some sort of mentor partner in whatever format that is. So you enjoy doing that.
I love doing that, and I also think you can broaden that, and certainly books I've read and people I've followed on social media would say when they're starting out, their mentors can be people whose books they've read, whose videos they've watched. They can all be incredibly invaluable in helping you. But and I've always been a solo founder, and it can be very, very lonely. And I think it's great to have a mentor. I also think if you're there are organizations out there now. None of this support was available. I recall back in 2009 when I took that leap. But there are so many organizations out there to reach out for help, to go to networking events. I'm doing my first event next week, actually, for the first time in pre-pandemic. And those are the kinds of places where, networking, kind of fills people with dread, that word. But, those are the kind of places where if you just walk up to, a circle of people and going, hi, do you mind if I join you? I don't know anybody here. Those are the opportunities where you can meet people who can move you and your business forward. I've got that many stories of when I used to host these events for Virgin Startup and doing my own podcast live, of people going, I even had someone the other day who said they met their wife at one of my events, which I'd never known. Yeah, I was like, okay, meeting your business partner. I had a few of those. I met my business partner at your event, but meeting your future wife there was pretty powerful. But yeah, I think having a mentor can be invaluable, but also picking a mentor that is at least a year, if not 3 to 5 years ahead of where you want to be, so that there's growth in that relationship as well, not someone who's in the same situation that you're in right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, good advice, Alex. Thank you. So then fast forward, when did your podcast get going?
So that's coming up to 7 years, actually. So that was January 2017 that I recorded the first, I think it was 6, it might have been 4 episodes. Funnily enough, when you look back at it, the first one was Stephen Bartlett, who seems to have done rather well for himself and didn't even have his own podcast at the time, and now is like the #1 podcast in Europe, I believe.
Yes, exactly. Okay. So tell what was the thought process behind starting a podcast in the first? I mean, so 7 years ago, there was podcasts around, but it certainly it didn't have the kind of the profile that it seemed to have now. So no. What inspired you to start your own podcast?
It was another podcast, funnily enough. And hopefully people listening to your podcast will be inspired to start their own as well. And look, for me, it was a podcast called How I Built This. hosted by a guy called Guy Raz, by a company called NPR. And essentially, you know, those are the stories of people who've built unbelievably successful businesses, be that a Patagonia, an Uber, an Airbnb. I was going to say WeWork, but it's a topical one at the moment. But they're those kind of billion-dollar stories. And at the time, I was working for Virgin Startup, and I just thought, I loved it. And I have no idea now who actually put me onto that or how I discovered that, but I did. I don't know how I discovered podcasts, but I did. And I thought, I love it. But after a while, after listening to them for a couple of years, and I used to love it, every month I would literally be waiting for my commute on Monday for that new episode to be there. And I felt cheated when they'd repeat the episode, one that I'd already heard before. But I thought, a lot of these stories are from people, and, you know, yes, a lot of business lessons are timeless, but equally, a lot of those businesses were set up when there was no internet, there was no social media, a very different time. And I thought, I'm working for Virgin Startup. I'm working with people who are still at the coalface, you know, in the trenches of starting a business. I'd like to do a podcast chatting to those people who are still, you know, learning those lessons, who haven't, you know, sold the company, exited and made their millions and billions. So I went to Virgin Startup with the idea of starting their own podcast. And ultimately, that became my own podcast because I became so frustrated with the red tape of what it became for them to approve the podcast. It took them 90 days and 24 people to approve my podcast. And even then, I got this call. I'll try and make it quick, but I got this call that when you're now going to have 3 phone calls, this is going to go from Virgin Startup to Virgin Group to Virgin PR to senior management. And I literally had these 3 calls throughout the day. And the first 2 calls were, it's approved. About 2 hours later, it's approved. The next one, we love it, but can you do 2 things? Can you re-record every single interview? And can you come up with a completely different concept? Because we're thinking of doing the same concept for another Virgin podcast.
Oh, God, yeah.
So I thought about it for about 0.5 seconds. And
That long.
And I thought it would be great having backing from the Virgin Group, because and a Virgin email address is fantastic, I have to say, in getting guests.
Sure.
And then I was like, let me take a leaf out of Richard's book, which is called Screw It, Let's Do It, and take the inspiration from my ex-boss, and let's screw it, just do it, and let's just start it myself, which is what I did. And I've never looked back. You know, it's the best thing that I've ever done, I have to say, other than, you know, meet my wife and marry her, I would say.
Second best thing, and your kids, but it's up there as one of the most important things you've ever done, which is really, really interesting. And as I kind of reflect, obviously I'm just over a year or so into my sort of podcasting journey.
Congratulations!
And I've got a view that everyone should have a podcast. Well, certainly everyone in business should have a podcast, even if the only people that ever listen to it are your customers, your clients, or something. It's a sort of a platform and a tool to share thoughts and ideas. And whether you do an interview, whether you do a solo or interview your clients or anything, and the barriers to entry for podcasting, which is why it's a few years ago it was just much harder to do in terms of the technology's moved on. You and I are sort of using some specific podcast software to have this right now. So it's really, a mic and a headset or something is pretty much all you need, and you can start your own podcast. But what are your thoughts on that whole idea of sort of personal brand building as it relates to business owners and entrepreneurs?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'm with you. I think at least every business owner, I agree, should try to start their own podcast. And for me, a podcast has changed what it was. I was listening at the podcast show Conversation between Holly Tucker, who founded Not on the High Street with Spencer Matthews, who now has a very popular entrepreneurship podcast called Big Fish. And she was very much of the ilk that my podcast will always be audio. It will stay audio. Whereas Spencer Matthews comes from reality TV. He's like, podcast for me is video. That's 50% of my audience. And it's a show. It's no longer a podcast. It's a show. And I get both arguments. I really do. But I think a podcast is a fantastic way for a business owner to build their own personal brand. And people, as we know, we've already said it, people buy from people. So, why wouldn't you want to spend time? And I used to cringe and shy away from the term personal brand, but I've learned to kind of embrace it now as as a tool for your business. Ultimately, it's a shop window for you. It's a shop window for your business. Richard Branson doesn't have a podcast, as far as I'm aware, but look at how his face is the face of the business, and he had a personal brand before anyone called it a personal brand.
Absolutely. And this is the interesting dynamic, because when I started the podcast, I didn't use this. I've got a whole bunch of colleagues who are fantastic people, and I thought, well, why should I just go out there and be the front? Because they're better than me, and and I'm like sort of taking all the glory. But I sort of cringed from. Then you realize, and someone's telling me, like, maybe on social media, Richard Branson's got however many million followers on Twitter, and Virgin's got a lot, but much less than him.
Exactly.
Elon Musk versus Tesla, and all these other people, human beings engage with people much more than they deal with any corporate or any business. So you're not necessarily sort of taking the glory, as it were. You're just representing your company. You're the face of the business. And what would as somebody who's obviously done this and done it very successfully, and we agree that, particularly for those running or sort of starting businesses, it's a good medium to share your thoughts, to let people understand and know you. But how does somebody get started then? If you just got an idea, all right, fine, I'll give this a go. What would you say are the sort of first one or two steps to progress that?
And I also think, before I say that, Alan, I was just talking about this yesterday. I think it's a fantastic tool, and I was chatting to a couple, husband and wife, who are starting a business together. Wow, what a thing to do. And for me, it's like, I started my podcast because, or it evolved into me being able to get in a room with people, or have a conversation, like a physical, virtual room like this, get into a virtual room with people that I would normally never, ever be able to get into a room with, the likes of a Stephen Bartlett, a Lord Billamoria from Cobra Beer, Ted Baker from Ray Kelvin from Ted Baker, people like that. But, once you do have a platform like that, people like to share their story, be that their personal story, their business story, enables you to do that. It also enables you to have conversations as a business owner with people you'd like to work with. That's a key one for us. We even have a client now who uses their podcast to onboard their clients and to onboard their staff. They have to listen to these certain episodes to understand, the values of the company and the corporate culture. And look, I can't remember how we initially connected, but I love your LinkedIn post. I think you use LinkedIn really well as a personal brand again, far better than 99% of the people out there, far better than me, in fact. I'd love to be able to kind of be far better at using LinkedIn, but for me, my medium that I use best is podcasting, and it's audio, but I've learned to embrace the video. And I think for anybody looking to get into podcasting, the beauty of it is you can transcribe your podcast, turn it into a blog, so you've got the written word, you've got the audio version, you've got the video version, and all of those are different ways that will speak to your audience in different ways. People are more visual learners, people are more oral learners, etc. So the barriers to entry, as you said, are far lower than they ever used to be. I wouldn't advise anybody to do it through their phone, but you can certainly get started that way. I even interviewed Maria Hatzistefanis, who's now a dragon on Dragon's Den in Greece, who owns a $100 million company called Rodeo. She was interviewing with her phone. She was traveling all around the world, in the fashion beauty space, and just interviewing people on a phone, just with plug in a clip-on microphone. You can clip on another one to your guest, and you can record through a free app on your phone. For me, I would go, let's use something like we're using, Riverside, which is basically like an online recording studio. Easiest way to do it, I think, is to literally have a conversation with a friend and talk about something that you have a common interest in. That can be as simple as last night's Champions League game, whatever that might be. That could be talking about, if you're a business owner, what the hell happened to WeWork? Let's talk about that, or let's review let's review a podcast interview. You know, there's that many people who have channels on YouTube that are just reviewing other people's stuff. There's so many ways, but I think for me it's choosing something. And I do an exercise where you literally get a blank piece of paper, draw a line down the middle. On the left-hand side, you go, let me write down everything that I have an interest in, that I'm super passionate about, that I would still want to talk about in 5-10 years time. On the right-hand side, let's write down everything I've got some degree of expertise in. And by expertise, I mean, you're just one step ahead of the person that you're teaching about this. So for me, it could be, I love watching rugby. I've got a qualification in coaching rugby. Draw a line between those two. And for me, it could also be, I've got an interest in podcasts. I love listening to podcasts. I have my own podcast. Draw a line between the two. So, you know, come up with something that you're passionate about and you've got some knowledge in talking about, and start a podcast about that.
Yeah, exactly. And you've got a business that can sort of help people get started on the podcast journey.
Yeah. So for those who want to, you know, scale things up, and they want somebody to take the stress out of that, then to take out the heavy lifting, then that's what we do. You know, I had a conversation yesterday with the CEO of a fintech company who's, you know, crazy busy, about to have his first child, flying to Riyadh next week, just come back from America, wants to start a podcast. And I'm like, okay, the barrier here is going to be, you're going to become the bottleneck, just as I am with my team. They're all chasing me for stuff. So I'm like, all we want you to do is to do what what Alan is doing right now, which is to have a great conversation for an hour every week. If we can batch that and maybe do that once a month in an afternoon when you're least productive, maybe it's a Friday like today, then fantastic. Yeah. We can do everything else, you know. Yeah. Or you've got, you know, typically, again, I deal with people who've already got a team who can do the editing and the production, but they don't know what they don't know. So I'll work with them as a consultant, and we'll get together every month, and we'll literally work on improving that podcast. Because as you'll know, Alan, the hardest thing to do is to launch a podcast. Once you've launched a podcast, the hardest thing to do becomes, how do I grow that podcast? Yeah. And then that's where I come in.
Yeah, absolutely. Very interesting. We'll certainly put a link to your website in the show notes, that people are interested in progressing this, because that's my view. I mean, years ago, I'm old enough to remember when businesses didn't have websites, and quite a way into the internet age, still quite a few companies didn't have websites. And I almost feel this is where we are now, that we will get to a point, we'll look back in 10 years, 20 years, I don't know, and say, you know, most companies didn't have, and most entrepreneurs didn't have their own podcast. You know, how strange, what strange times. I just think there'll be more and more, because it'd be so easy. And as you say, it is literally that we're doing now. We're just having a chat, having a conversation. And I think the other thing that I've learned is you don't need to necessarily, you know, look at, you know, Stephen Bartlett's numbers and the millions and millions of downloads they get. If there's, in fact, when you got started, I read something that you had 2 listeners. It was your
2 downloads. Your wife
and 2 downloads.
And that was week 1. That wasn't even day 1. That was week 1. Yeah.
Which it can be a challenge when you get going. But that's the other thing about it is just the consistency. I heard some other strange statistic though about if you publish 21 episodes of any podcast, you're in the top 1%, I think, or top 10%. So you're a very elite group, because so many podcasts do half a dozen episodes and think, oh, I'm only getting 2 downloads, and so they stop. But it's the power of compounding, the cumulative effect of just keep going. So
absolutely,
so the work you're doing would be really interesting.
Yeah,
and really helpful.
You're right. So with those facts, just for people to know again, and I only found this out earlier this year, it was 24 or 26% of people only ever release a show trailer, so they never even get to episode 1, and you're like, wow. And then another stat was 46% of people never release episode 11. So you're like, okay, if 50% of people won't even get to the end of 90 days, if you're thinking we're releasing 1 a week, then I fancy my chances, because those people are quitters. I'm not a quitter. I know, just as you said, consistency is key. Compound things over time, just like, you know, accumulating wealth. The returns are unbelievable. But if you don't know what you don't know, you got to start somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say to anyone thinking about doing it, commit to doing 100 episodes. Do 100 and then see how you feel, because you will know for sure by then, but you wouldn't know after even 20 or 30.
No.
And in my experience, a podcast it can pivot. It can take. I've changed the name of mine over time, and I've sort of gone down a couple of different routes because I felt that was just more beneficial. You learn by doing, I think, is the point.
Yeah.
And you just used to be like any business or any startup. Just a couple of more questions. When you've had, I don't know, how many episodes? Hundreds and hundreds?
500 and something. I don't even know what episode we're at. We're not at 550 yet, but we're somewhere coming up to there, yeah.
Right, so you're well into the hundreds and obviously interviewed and spoken with a lot of people. What are they, if you just reflect back, are there some specific key highlights or conversations or lessons learned from all these people that you've spoken to? What stands out for you as you reflect back on all those 550 or so?
Really good question. And I always remember, and it was the most nervous I've ever been interviewing someone, even though it was virtual. It was with Lewis Howes, who has a podcast called The School of Greatness. And I think it was because that was one of the first podcasts that I listened to, and I saw how successful he was. It took me a year to get the interview, but as is often the case, if you're persistent and you keep asking, when it suits the other person, the stars will align. And for him, he was releasing his second book, so he wanted to do a podcast tour, which is basically getting on every podcast he possibly can to shout about it. But he'd just come off the Ellen show, which is like one of the biggest shows in America. So I was quite nervous about it. But I remember him saying to me that he takes a lesson from every single interview that he does, and he writes down what he's learned from every interview that he's done, and he's done, in the thousands now. And I just always remember thinking, remember that, take a lesson from every single interview that you've done. And for me, I think, some of the ones that would stand out would probably be reflecting back. And it was at that time, I suppose, reflecting back, I interviewed Ed Williams and Jamie Lang from Candy Kittens, sweet brand.
Yeah.
And they've gone on and, been incredibly successful, raised a, huge amount of money from the biggest confectioner in the world, and some venture capital money. But I remember them saying multiple times that they had missed payroll. And at the time, when you're speaking to someone who's got a really big public persona, millions of followers on all these TV shows and stuff, to hear that from somebody like, you're like, oh, okay. So if, you guys have struggled as well, then, I'll take that on board. So that was a big one. I think the Lewis Howes one, and then people like Piers Linney, former Dragon's Den investor, who's become a very good friend, and that was literally one LinkedIn message. He said yes. He actually ended up driving down from Preston to Bournemouth, like about, I think, 6 hours to speak at an event I did. I literally just paid for his petrol and put him up in the local hotel. And off the back of that, we've done, probably 20 things together over the years that the last 3 4 or 5 years that we've known each other. So people like that, Al Barrett from Grenade, who's become a friend, and you just think, wow, this is just from not being afraid to literally just send someone a message, and most people fail in the follow up. Alan, I would say again, I think it's all in the follow up. Because 99% of people won't follow up, and to be able to have those people in your back pocket, I think, to be able to go, okay, so if my business gets to the stage that I want to exit, I could phone up a Piers Linney, I could phone up an Al Barrett who's just exited to Cadbury's for 250 million, and go, what would your advice be, man? What would you do in this situation?
Yeah, absolutely. It's building that community, that network of people that you've now. I agree as well. The podcasting is an opportunity to connect with people that you otherwise wouldn't have done
massively,
and then you're somehow in their network and in their circle, and in future times, if you can be a benefit to each other, it always helps. I use this, the phrase I picked up somewhere is just increasing your surface area of luck, I suppose. You've now got just got more people, and you network with more people, and some know each other. I've had Piers on my podcast, and he is great. He's a great guy, and really interesting stories. And he actually, just joining all these dots, he tells a story. I'm sure he shared that with you about his experience with Sir Richard Branson as well, out in the Caribbean. So it's great. Yeah, I'm firmly in favour of it. So as we're kind of winding towards the end, this has been really interesting. So, an incredible journey you've been on. What's next for Alex? How do you see the future going in your own continued entrepreneurial journey?
You caught me at a time that I'm actually revisiting that. I'm definitely at the stage where I've just taken the first ever break from my own podcast and relaunched it, and launched my first ever YouTube channel, and I'm absolutely loving that. I'm actually finding it fascinating, and starting from ground zero, and 100 subscribers and 12,000 views, but seeing already success with particular episodes and what's resonating with the audience, and so much to learn. So for me, I'd like to take that even more seriously, because having a podcast agency, my podcast ended up from being the most important one to being the least important one, and now it's like I'm bringing that to the front. It's like a no-brainer. I'm saying to the team, like, look, if my podcast is the best podcast we could possibly release, why wouldn't that attract more people who'd want to work with us and do the same?
Absolutely.
So I'd like to spend more time on that. And again, I've gone all in. I've gone recording all of mine in a studio in London. Rich Roll and Stephen Bartlett, High Performance Podcast, all record from the same studio. So it's as high end as you can go. I really like helping people when it comes to this medium that we're on now, but aligning that with how do they build their personal brand, their business brand, how do they use this vehicle to be able to do that? So I'm enjoying more. I'm just working with just finalizing a contract now with the one of the biggest business organizations in the world when it comes to coaching. And it's, for me, I love that side of it rather than the kind of hands-on, this is how we edit and produce your podcast. It's more like the bigger picture for me of the strategy, the tactics on how we can do that. So I'd love to do more of that. Ultimately, I'd love to somehow, how do I end up getting to help younger people start their businesses and ultimately get from where they are to where they want to be? How do you help someone do that? Like, I don't know if you know Simon Squibb. I love what Simon's doing. I've interviewed Simon a couple of times. Give without take. I love that. That's definitely for me. It's those worlds of business and podcasting is definitely still. I feel like I'm doing what I love, and if it's having an impact, if I can help people, then I want to keep on doing that.
It's incredible. I can tell in your voice, the way you're describing this this future that you see for yourself. You're excited about it.
Yeah.
Because if you can follow that, as they say, follow your passion, things you're interested in, and content creation and media in general, but also linking it to business and to entrepreneurs, and also helping people at the intersection of all those various things, you could get really excited about it. I can tell, and you can create a bright future, and you don't necessarily know exactly what path you'll follow. One thing could lead to another, and then we'll see how that goes. The other thing you said, which I just thought was super interesting, because I've just done exactly that, which is to book time out by myself to do this period of reflection and planning, really. And I think it's anyone listening to this, I would strongly encourage, as you're doing as well, and I am, to do that, because we just need time to think. We need time to and even for me, I'll just be by myself, no kids or anything else, and no business, and go for walks. I'm going to book somewhere else to take myself away from my immediate environment, home or office.
That's exactly what I do.
I think, I think business owners, I don't think we do that enough. I've done it in the past, but not as much and not as organized. But I said this time, I'm really going to get ahead of it. And it's just interesting that you need time to slow down. I think my brain probably works a bit like yours. I'm just busy. My head's busy all the time. And it probably takes a day or two just to calm down and
decompress.
Stop thinking about things and just reflect. As you said, if you can join all those other dots about a bit of exercise, go for a walk, go for a run. It's a bit of I just think it's something that we all should do. So just when you mentioned that, and we won't have time for it now, but I'd love to pick your brains at some stage on your 100 questions, because that's an interesting process, I'm sure.
Yeah, I can share
to
it
go
with
through.
You.
So
and again, it's just me that to say what you said, Alan. It's zooming out, because we all zoom in so much and focused on the micro, and these things, these smartphones don't help that, because we're physically zooming in to look at the thing as well, and I feel. It's the same with our business, with our podcast. It's having that opportunity to zoom out, and I go and stay at my favorite hotel, which is in the New Forest, and I literally spend a day there, a couple of days, but I'll come home, in the evening. I'll go back out there for the day, and like you say, it takes a day just to decompress and kind of relax into that process. Yeah, at least.
Yeah. Very, very good. Right. Well, as we sort of winding our way towards the end of the conversation, which has been great, just to reflect back, you obviously you've got your podcast and the website and the platform there, but in terms of other resources, you've had obviously a very interesting entrepreneurial journey yourself. Are you a book reader? Well, you mentioned a couple of ones already. What sort of resources have you found helpful to support your own personal business journey?
Yeah, I'm an avid reader. I kind of flip between I flip between like those kind of business / self-improvement books and historical fiction, which I love, and it's always Vikings and Romans and all that kind of stuff for me.
Okay, yeah, something completely different. Yeah,
something completely different. A total escapism. But yeah, I would say to anybody to start with the Robert Kiyosaki book, Rich Dad Poor Dad, because that started me on my journey. I would say a current book that I'm reading would be Alex Hormozi, $100 million offers, $100 million offers. Yeah, and I think a lot of us used to listen, follow Gary Vaynerchuk, and I kind of got tired with that hustle culture. Which again I think he's pushed back on, and I think Alex seems to be positioning himself as the next coming of entrepreneurship male. But equally, if you're female, I love the girls from Boss Babe, like Danielle Canty. I follow them on social media. I've tried to get her on a couple of times, and we've had a few messages, but never got her. The stars have never aligned when she's been over here. But I think also resources. I think I would encourage people to look at like Virgin Startup. If you're in the UK, look at the events they put on. Networking, like I say, it can kind of send out the right vibes. But if you just look at it as somewhere to go to be inspired and to meet like-minded people,
sure. Yeah.
Why wouldn't you go and to learn and do that? How I Built This is still my favorite podcast. To listen to.
Yeah, I listened to that one. It's great.
Yeah, for those, and really everybody talks about Diary of a CEO, and Stephen gets great guests. He's done amazing things with that podcast. My favorite podcast is the High Performance podcast. So I would encourage people to use like Jake and Damien, who I'm getting on my show as well. We're just talking at the moment. That would be great to get him on. But yeah, those would be kind of my
those are great. Absolutely. And if people listening to this haven't picked up on all those, of course, put links again to all those in the notes people can click through. That's a lot of information. You sort of get absorbing all that stuff. Read those books, listen to those podcasts. You'll there's no excuse for progress. There's lots of lessons learned, and that's the other thing. There's lots of people who've shared their stories, and there's so many. I like reading biographies, autobiographies. There's so many lessons you can learn from people that just share everything and all the journey they've been on, including Richard Branson and many others. So really, really helpful list. Appreciate that. I always throw this curveball towards the end of the conversation when I ask a specific question. As you know, my day job is running a wealth management business primarily for business owners and entrepreneurs, and helping them navigate the sort of financial complexities around this concept of wealth. But everyone's got a different definition of wealth. What's your definition of true wealth, Alex?
Yeah, it's a great question to end on. Actually, I've pondered this one, and again, it's something that's kind of come into my thinking over the last year or so, and I think for me it's fulfillment, and that can mean many different things to many different people. But and it's not necessarily just being happy with where you are in life. We can talk about financial wealth. We can talk about wealth in many different areas, but I think I've come to the conclusion. For me, and we all aspire to to better ourselves and give our children, our friends, family opportunities that we maybe never had. But I think it's that search for being fulfilled, because I think if you're fulfilled, then all areas of your life should be, you should be singing from the same hymn sheet in all areas of your life. When you get, as I talked before, that physical and the mental, zooming out, getting out into nature, I think all of those things are so important. Ultimately, they should lead to fulfillment for you.
It's a good word, isn't it? Fulfillment. I'm just reflecting on that, and that's ultimately what we all want. It doesn't necessarily need a ton of money either.
No,
I think that's the point. You can achieve
agreed.
fulfillment through multiple different ways. But that's a great answer. Thanks so much for that.
Pleasure.
Now we mentioned, as I say, we'll put your links to your website in the notes. But is that the best way? If people want to sort of listen to this, then reach out to you, get in contact with you to learn more. Is that the best way to do that?
Yeah, I always say, again, have a listen to the podcast. Screw It, Just Do It. You can get hold of me, Alex at screwitjustdoit.org. Website, alexchisnall.com. And then Podpreneur, the organisation as well, the podcast agency. Easy way to, and you'll find me everywhere on social media at Alex Chisnall. So pretty easy to get found, I think.
Perfect. No excuse for anyone who wants to get in touch with you. They can do it pretty easily, as you say. So, once again, let me just say thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. Lots of insights, lots of gems of wisdom.
Loved it.
Thank you so much. Take care.
You too. Thanks, Alan. Much appreciated.